Okay, so for this next video lecture, we will be discussing about further audit procedures. So the nature of an audit procedure, this refer to its purpose. It may be a test of controls or substantive procedures, and its type, which can be either through inspection, inquiry, observation, confirmation, and others. So here, the audit procedure will depend on the type also of the audit evidence that the auditor wants to gather. Okay, so as we go along, we will discuss these audit procedures. So the auditor's assessment of the risks of material misstatement at the assertion level is performed, as mentioned before in our previous video lecture, by assessing the inherent and control risk. So preliminarily, the auditor will assess this inherent and control risk to help him also determine the risk of material misstatement at the assertion level or even at the financial statement level. So the auditor's risk may affect also both the types of audit procedures to be performed as well as the combination as shown in our previous video lecture as well in the table, which summarizes the level of control risk assessed and the detection risk that the auditor is willing to accept, as well as the response either to perform test of control or substantive procedure or combination of both. So for example, when an assessed risk is high, okay, so the auditor will confirm the completeness of the terms of the contract with the counterparty in addition to inspecting the document. So meaning to say in this case, the auditor will determine or gather evidence not only from within the entity, he will also gather evidence to the party that is involved in the contract, okay, to confirm if that really exists or that transaction exists or occurred, and trace that also in the financial records if it was appropriately and properly recorded in the books of the entity. Okay, so this is how substantive procedures is done, because in this case the assessed risk is high, so substantive procedures are performed. Okay, also certain audit procedures may be more appropriate for some assertions than others. Okay, again, it depends on the assessed level of risk and the status as well of the internal control, if that is effective or ineffective. Okay, and on the detection risk, okay, at the same time. So for instance, in relation to revenue, test of controls may be most responsive to the assessed risk of misstatement of the completeness assertion. Okay, because in this case, test of controls may detect some misstatements which is related to revenue, like testing if the entity is following the standards in terms of revenue recognition. Okay, so whereas substantive procedures may be most responsive to the assessed risk of material misstatement in the occurrence assertion. So meaning to determine if the revenue transaction, that the transaction that gave rise to the revenue did exist. Okay, and if that is for the current period, if that revenue is recognizable or not. Okay, so the reasons for the assessment given to a risk are also relevant in determining the nature of the audit procedure. So again, it will depend on the assessed level of risk. So for instance, if the assessed risk is lower because the internal controls are strong, so the auditor will rely on that low assessment. Then he will perform test of those controls because again, it is operating effectively. So in addition also to substantive procedures which are less, and the auditor can perform this substantive procedure in interim dates. Okay, so those are for the further audit procedure. So for this video lecture, we will continue with the timing of further audit procedures. So the timing of an audit procedure, this refers to when the procedure will be performed, or the period or the date to which the audit evidence applies, or when is the best time to gather these evidences. So the auditor will perform this test of controls or the substantive procedures either at the interim date or at the end of the period, again, depending on the level of the assessed risks. So the higher the risk of material misstatement, more likely the auditor will perform more substantive procedures nearer or at the end of the period so that all the transactions are completed and the financial statements are also prepared, almost completed as well. Okay, to audit and apply audit procedures in all of the assertions. Okay, so this can also, or the auditor can also perform these procedures on an unannounced basis so that to make sure that the uh, employees or the people within the entity are not prepared, okay, for the procedures, and therefore the auditor could assess, okay, more objectively, okay, this controls or transaction. Conversely, the auditor may perform the audit procedures before the period end to assist him in identifying significant matters at early stage. So, consequently, to resolve them with the assistance of management or to develop an effective audit approach to address also such matters. So, nevertheless, the following audit procedures can be performed only or after the period end. So, these are the agreeing or to determine if financial statements agrees or it reconciles with accounting records. So here the auditor will wait for the financial statements to be completed to do so. Another is examining adjustments made during the course of preparing the FS. So we all know that adjustments are normally prepared at the end of the accounting period. Another is procedures to respond to arrests that are at period end, of course. Okay, so those are the timing of further audit procedures. Okay, so we will continue with the extent of further audit procedure. So the extent of audit procedures, this refers to the quantity to be performed, meaning the number of samples to be examined to gather the audit evidence. So the extent of audit procedures judged necessary is determined after considering materiality, assessment of risk, and the degree of assurance to the auditor that he plans to obtain. Okay, so ordinarily, the extent of audit procedures increases the risk of material mistake as the risk of material misstatement also increases, meaning more samples should be evaluated to gather more evidence. However, increasing the extent of audit procedure is effective only if the audit procedure itself is relevant to the specific risk, or else this will be impractical. Okay, so the use of computer-assisted audit techniques may enable more extensive testing of electronic transactions and account files, which may be useful when the auditor decides to modify the extent of testing. So, for example, in responding to the risk of material misstatement due to fraud. So here, if the audit evidence will be gathered from an electronic transaction, so the auditor will use computer-assisted audit techniques as well to complement and to get the necessary audit evidence that he needs. Okay, so those are for the extent of audit procedures. Further audit procedures.